In 1862, deep in the forests of upstate New York, 143 unmarked graves were discovered beneath the floorboards of a long-abandoned church. Authorities found each skeleton bore signs of horrific abuse, healed fractures, evidence of near drownings, and strange symbols etched into their bones. For over 160 years, the truth about the so-called Church of the Pure Spirit remained hidden behind federal secrecy, locked away from public view. But now, for the first time, previously unreleased documents reveal the chilling story of three brothers, Elder Ezra, Deacon Silas, and Prophet Caleb Ravencroft, who convinced hundreds that salvation could only be earned through pain. In the early 1800s, the small town of Ravenwood, nestled between thick forests and hills about 40 miles north of Albany, was just one of many quiet communities shaped by the religious fervor of the Second Great Awakening. Help me with a like and a subscribe to motivate me to make better videos, and don't forget to comment which country you are from. This wave of spiritual revivalism swept across the region, birthing new faiths and empowering charismatic leaders. In 1825, the Ravencroft brothers arrived in Ravenwood with money conviction and a message that promised divine clarity through physical suffering. Elder Ezra, the eldest at 42, was commanding and intense, his dark gaze unsettling. Silas, the middle brother at 39, was scholarly and soft-spoken, often seen scribbling notes on theology. The youngest, Caleb, 35, was the most mysterious. His pale blue eyes frequently rolled back during trances. He called divine visions, and his whispered sermons somehow carried across entire rooms. They quickly bought land and built a church. Unlike any other dark stone, no windows, octagonal in shape, with 8 adjoining chambers and a towering steeple that seemed absurdly tall for such a remote place. At their first sermon, Ezra declared their mission purification through tribulation. Theirs wasn't just another splinter group in a time of spiritual upheaval. It was a doctrine built on literal suffering. They preached that the flesh must be broken to free the soul, that pain cleansed sin, and only through enduring torment could one become truly pure. As their reputation grew, so did their numbers. But not everyone was welcomed. Admission required a private interview with Prophet Caleb, who would decide if the soul was worthy of cleansing. Among the earliest followers was Margaret Wilkins, a grieving widow who had lost her entire family to disease. She described her first meeting with Ezra as a spiritual awakening. "He looked at me like he could see my thoughts," she later wrote. "He said my pain had purpose. For the first time since the funerals, I felt something other than grief." By 1827, the Church of the Pure Spirit had close to 100 followers. Some built homes around the church. Others lived in Ravenwood, but spent every waking hour under the Ravencrofts' control. The line between spiritual devotion and psychological domination blurred, setting the stage for one of the darkest religious movements in American history. The Ravencroft brothers urged their followers to give up their property and life savings, insisting that clinging to worldly possessions blocked spiritual elevation. Those who proved most devoted were offered a special title, Vessels of the Spirit, but this honor came with a heavy price, more grueling purification rituals. In the beginning, these ceremonies seemed harsh, but not inhuman. Days of fasting, nights spent in prayer, and shockingly cold water rituals meant to drown the sinful self. But what outsiders failed to grasp was how carefully the Ravencrofts were turning up the heat, slowly increasing the intensity of suffering so followers wouldn't notice they were being conditioned for far worse. By 1829, with construction underway on a sprawling underground chamber network beneath the church, the brothers had full control of their followers' time, minds, and bodies. That winter, Prophet Caleb made a chilling declaration to his brothers: "The sheep have been gathered. Now begins the true work of the shepherd." And with that, Ravenwood would soon learn that the brothers' idea of shepherding had more to do with sacrifice than salvation. The turning point came on December 21st, 1829, the winter solstice, the longest night of the year. The event that night, later recorded in secret documents as the First Ascension, marked the beginning of the church's darkest chapter. Elder Ezra announced that Prophet Caleb had received a divine vision, and the entire congregation was summoned to the sanctuary. Inside the windowless stone chamber, lit only by 12 massive candles placed around an enormous spiral pattern carved into the floor, nearly 150 followers gathered in silence. Thomas Hartford, a blacksmith and recent convert, would later recount the night in chilling detail after fleeing the cult. According to Hartford, Elder Ezra spoke with an urgency never heard before. He told the crowd that their earlier suffering had been merely preparation, and now the Spirit demanded greater sacrifice. Then Prophet Caleb emerged, his skin ghostly pale, his movements unnatural, his eyes rolled back in a trance. Speaking in eerie, otherworldly sounds that filled the room with dread, Caleb collapsed. When he rose again, he delivered a message with unnerving calm. The Spirit had chosen 3 followers for the honor of ascension. He named Sarah Pembroke, Michael Collins, and Rebecca Winters. The 3 were led to the central platform and stripped to their undergarments despite the bitter cold. They were tied to inverted crosses, which Ezra explained represented the reversal of pride into humility and life into rebirth through death. Then began what the Ravencrofts called the 7 trials of purification. The first, the trial of air, simulated drowning. Wet cloths were placed over their faces while water was poured over them. Then came the trial of earth, where they were packed in soil up to their necks. The trial of fire involved branding with heated metal in symbolic patterns. The trial of water saw them submerged in freezing water until they lost consciousness. Hartford, overcome with nausea and fear, barely remembered the final 3 trials, but the congregation was instructed to chant, "Through suffering comes purity. Through purity comes elevation." Every time the victims screamed, some wept, others looked away, but many watched enraptured, eyes wide with what Hartford described as reverence or ecstasy. The cult's slow conditioning had worked. Pain was now worship. As dawn approached and the tortured victims hung limp, Elder Ezra declared their sin had been burned away. Prophet Caleb touched each one, whispering into their ears. What happened next horrified even the most loyal. The victims convulsed violently. Bones, cracked eyes burst open, and each began to speak in the strange language Caleb had used earlier. By sunrise, they were dead. Ezra proclaimed their spirits had bypassed judgment and entered heaven directly. Their bodies, he said, were now sacred relics. Instead of burying them, the corpses were displayed on stone slabs in the newly built underground chambers where followers could pray for similar elevation. These were the first of what would become hundreds of bodies stored beneath the Church of the Pure Spirit. The morning after, a few quietly fled Ravenwood, including Hartford. He would remain silent for years, convinced no one would believe what he had witnessed. But those who stayed became even more fanatical. The brothers had crossed into ritual murder, and instead of losing control, they became more powerful. Within their twisted doctrine, death was no longer a punishment. It was a holy rite. And as Prophet Caleb chillingly told his brothers afterward, "Now we have shown them the true face of God, and they did not turn away. There is nothing they will not accept from us now." He was right. The First Ascension was only the beginning of what would become a 30-year descent into darkness at the Church of the Pure Spirit. From 1830 to 1845, the Ravencroft brothers refined their disturbing theology and perfected the logistics of what they called elevations, a term that masked the reality of ritual murder. On the surface, the church appeared devout and charitable, echoing the moral fervor of the Second Great Awakening. They hosted public revivals, donated to causes like temperance and orphan care, and welcomed visiting preachers with open arms. But beneath this polished facade, something far more sinister unfolded. The underground chambers, originally built as modest cellars, grew into a labyrinth of hidden tunnels and sanctified torture rooms, all excavated by loyal followers, those deemed vessels of the spirit who had proven themselves worthy of deeper secrets. By 1835, the so-called catacombs featured specialized spaces, a chamber of preparation for isolating candidates, a chamber of trials for administering the 7 purifications, a chamber of ascension where deaths occurred, and the chilling chamber of saints where the dead were displayed in grotesque reverence. Unlike most faiths that buried their dead with solemnity, the Ravencrofts preserved them in carefully arranged tableaux. Some were mummified, others reduced to clean skeletons. These remains were posed in prayerful positions, wired into place and surrounded by scents the brothers claimed were divine, but as survivors later revealed, were embalming chemicals. Elizabeth Carver, who joined the church in 1832 and escaped 12 years later, provided vivid accounts. She recalled being introduced to the catacombs in stages, first as metaphor, then as sacred space. By the time she saw the corpses, she was so indoctrinated she wept in awe rather than fear. Elevations escalated from rare occurrences to monthly rituals with special mass ceremonies held on solstices and equinoxes. The selection process also evolved. At first, only the isolated or socially invisible widows, orphans, drifters were chosen, but later loyal families within the congregation began competing for the honor of offering a child or spouse to the spirit. Parents begged for their children to be taken. Carver recalled believing it the ultimate act of faith. The 3 brothers remained the church's pillars, but Prophet Caleb increasingly became its driving force. Former Inner Circle members described how his visions, once sparse, became constant and erratic. By 1840, Caleb alone chose who would die and how. His private journals, discovered hidden in his quarters, were filled with disturbing anatomical sketches and rambling entries. One read, "The soul is mapped in nodes across the body. Every elevation teaches me more. Soon I will chart the divine anatomy in full." As membership swelled toward 300, the brothers faced a grim logistical challenge: what to do with the mounting number of bodies. Their solution was as cold as it was cunning. Deacon Silas, leveraging his academic contacts, began selling corpses to medical schools desperate for cadavers. At the time, such institutions faced strict legal limitations, creating a black market where unclaimed or illegally obtained bodies were in high demand. Between 1840 and 1845, records show the church donated at least 67 vessels to medical science, an antiseptic euphemism for the sale of murdered victims. This gruesome commerce not only erased evidence, but also generated substantial revenue and gave Silas access to advanced medical knowledge. He used this to refine their techniques, learning how to inflict pain without leaving marks, and how to preserve bodies more effectively. These enhancements would make future atrocities more controlled and harder to detect. By 1845, the Church of the Pure Spirit had become a grotesque hybrid, part cult, part killing machine, part business. It was a self-sustaining system of belief, sacrifice, and profit built on layers of deception and cruelty. Hidden behind the mask of religious revival, the Ravencrofts had created one of the most terrifying institutions in American history. Disguised as spiritual advancement, the Church of the Pure Spirit had become what one federal investigator would later call a perfect machine for evil, operating in plain sight under the protection of religious freedom. Despite the Ravencroft brothers' careful management of their public image, whispers began to spread. Too many people had joined the church only to vanish from the public eye. Those who escaped rarely spoke about what they had seen, haunted by fear or disbelief, but their hollow stares and refusal to discuss their time in Ravenwood only deepened suspicions. These murmurs might have remained just rumors if not for a financial investigation that would eventually expose the horror hiding beneath the surface. It began with James Thornhill, a postal inspector tracking irregularities in upstate New York's banking system. He noticed strange patterns, large deposits from the Church of the Pure Spirit, always in cash, and transfers labeled as research donations to medical institutions in cities like Albany, Philadelphia, and Baltimore. At first, he suspected financial fraud, but when he crossed paths with Martha Simmons, a former member who fled after witnessing her sister's elevation, his investigation took a darker turn. Though initially hesitant, Simmons eventually described underground chambers, the ritualistic torture of followers and children taken for special blessings who never returned. Her claims were too surreal to believe, except they perfectly matched the strange financial trails Thornhill had uncovered. He took his findings to his superiors, but without concrete proof, the case stalled. Religious freedom made any action against a church politically and legally fraught. Still, Thornhill pressed on building a secret network of informants. One was Dr. William Garrett, a physician in Albany, who noticed something disturbing about the cadavers allegedly donated by the church. Unlike standard anatomical donations, these bodies bore signs of trauma before death, fractures that had begun to heal, consistent asphyxiation, and stress markers that suggested systematic abuse. In 1850, Garrett quietly shared his findings with Thornhill, marking the first scientific evidence that something was deeply wrong inside the church. But it wasn't until the mental collapse of Prophet Caleb Ravencroft that the cult's facade began to crack. By 1851, Caleb's behavior had grown erratic and frightening. During services, he raved about spirits crawling from the walls and divine anatomy glowing in the air. The brothers responded by locking him in a specially built chamber deep underground, hidden from the outside world. But on June 17, 1851, Caleb escaped. Naked, bleeding from self-inflicted wounds, he stumbled into Ravenwood's town square during a local celebration. Before a stunned crowd, he declared himself the living vessel of the pure spirit and shouted that 27 vessels had been emptied, their essence now within him. He described in graphic detail the tortures and rituals taking place beneath the church. Authorities initially treated him as insane, but once he identified himself as Prophet Caleb, the infamous Ravencroft brother, the tone shifted. Thornhill rushed to Ravenwood and met with Caleb, now clearly in a state of psychological collapse. Yet during moments of lucidity, Caleb provided maps of the underground chambers, described the Chamber of Saints, and confirmed accounts from earlier escapees. With his confession in hand, Thornhill finally obtained authorization for a formal investigation. However, the Ravencrofts acted swiftly. Learning of Caleb's capture, Elder Ezra and Deacon Silas initiated a contingency plan ominously named the Cleansing Flame. Inner Circle members rushed to destroy incriminating evidence, especially financial records and the bodies of recently elevated followers. Then, in a final act of desperation and calculated control, they set fire to the main church building. The blaze was precise, designed to consume only select areas, suggesting they intended to erase evidence while maintaining the illusion of tragedy. The Church of the Pure Spirit had spent decades building a mask of righteousness, wealth, and order. But beneath that mask was a system of control, torture, and ritual murder that finally began to unravel, not through confrontation, but through the unraveling mind of the very prophet who helped create it. By the time federal authorities arrived with a search warrant on June 19, 1851, the Church of the Pure Spirit presented the illusion of tragedy, not calculated cover-up. The main building had suffered selective fire damage, and the congregation was busy with what appeared to be honest recovery efforts. Elder Ezra met officials with open arms, expressing sorrow over both the fire and Prophet Caleb's mental collapse. "It seems God has tested us doubly," he reportedly said, "first with the affliction of my beloved brother's mind, and now with this terrible fire. But we shall rebuild as faith must always rise from ashes." The investigation that followed faced immediate hurdles. The main entrance to the tunnel system had been collapsed by the fire, and by the time it was reopened, parts of the chambers had been deliberately flooded with water diverted from a nearby stream. Still enough remained intact to confirm Prophet Caleb's shocking confessions. In rooms untouched by fire or flood, investigators found modified restraints tools for inflicting pain and embalming chemicals. But the most damning discovery was in the Chamber of Saints. Despite attempts to remove the bodies, dozens of human remains were found in haunting arrangements. Skeletons posed in prayer, preserved corpses seated as if in a twisted congregation, and worst of all, children's remains displayed as though at play, all showing clear signs of violent deaths. The scene was so horrific that seasoned investigators were left shaken. Daniel Blackwood, the lead federal agent, wrote in his report, "The scene defies adequate description. Public reaction was equally horrified." Though Victorian standards heavily censored press coverage, the Albany Evening Journal's June 25th headline captured the horror house of worship revealed as Charnel House Brothers accused of unspeakable acts in the name of religion. Elder Ezra and Deacon Silas denied everything. They claimed Prophet Caleb acted in secret and that they were shocked by his crimes. Given their tight control over church operations, their claims might have seemed plausible until investigators uncovered a hidden ledger beneath Silas's quarters. Written in his own hand, the book documented every elevation from 1829 to 1851. Names, dates, methods, even the final disposition of remains, including notations of those sold to medical schools, were meticulously recorded. The ledger also detailed the roles each brother played, including Elder Ezra's hand in selecting victims. With that evidence, along with Caleb's confession and witness testimonies from survivors, authorities charged Elder Ezra and Deacon Silas Ravencroft with murder, fraud, and desecration of human remains. Their arrest on July 3, 1851, marked the beginning of one of the most shocking trials of the 19th century. Authorities shielded much of the grimmest evidence from the public to avoid panic, but the revelations sparked national outrage. As the case unfolded, investigators realized the horror wasn't confined to Ravenwood. The brothers had built an intricate system that infiltrated religion, medicine, and finance. Caleb, mentally unfit for trial, was committed to the state asylum in Utica. His brothers remained in custody as federal agent Daniel Blackwood expanded the investigation, uncovering a criminal empire that predated Ravenwood by decades. According to newly discovered documents in a vault beneath Silas's quarters, the Ravencrofts had operated under various aliases since at least 1817. They established religious communities in Connecticut, Pennsylvania, and Ohio, gathering vulnerable followers, experimenting under the guise of spiritual purification, and vanishing just before scrutiny fell. Ravenwood had simply been their most successful and longest-running operation, but they weren't acting alone. Correspondence between Deacon Silas and prominent medical institutions revealed a disturbing complicity. A letter from a Philadelphia anatomist in 1844 praised the preparation of cadavers sent from the church, stating, "It is as though the bodies were prepared for our work while still living." This correspondence confirmed that the church's victims were used not only for ritual, but also for experimental anatomy. They weren't simply murdered, they were studied in life and death. Dr. Samuel Prescott of Albany Medical College, after examining records and remains, testified that the Ravencrofts had essentially conducted a primitive research program. The injury patterns, preservation methods, and anatomical records suggest deliberate studies of the body's response to extreme stimuli, especially pain, he stated. Then, in August 1851, the investigation took an unexpected turn. A physician from Boston, Dr. Jonathan Crane, came forward. He had studied at Harvard in the 1820s and recalled a visiting lecturer named Simon Ravingwood, who had presented disturbing theories on pain and spiritual ecstasy. Crane identified Ravingwood as none other than Silas Ravencroft. The doctrines of the Church of the Pure Spirit weren't merely religious manipulation, they were constructed as a scientific front for human experimentation. This claim was substantiated when authorities uncovered a hidden chamber beneath Silas's living quarters. Inside were hundreds of notebooks filled with detailed diagrams, experimental protocols, and observations written over decades. The early entries were couched in religious language, but over time they grew clinical. One chilling note from 1848 read, "Subject 157 maintained consciousness for 47 minutes after removal of redacted." The brothers weren't just cult leaders, they were pseudo-scientists using religion as a mask for systematic torture, dissection, and behavioral manipulation. In the end, the Ravencroft case became more than a tale of religious delusion. It was a story of how belief power and pseudoscience can be fused into an instrument of unimaginable horror. The church burned. Its leaders were imprisoned or institutionalized. But the secrets they buried, some literal, continued to surface for years, revealing layer upon layer of a nightmare that had hidden for decades in the guise of faith. As investigators dug deeper into the Ravencroft case, the true scale and nature of the horrors they uncovered surpassed even the darkest early suspicions. Among the most chilling findings were the scientific records that described victims' final moments with clinical precision. One entry reading heart continued functioning for 12 minutes beyond loss of consciousness. Vocalization patterns consistent with previous trials. Blood loss approximately 1.7 liters. These cold, methodical observations supported the hypothesis that the brothers were studying how long vital functions could persist under extreme suffering. When presented with this evidence during interrogation, Elder Ezra's facade finally cracked. According to transcripts, he laughed for nearly a full minute before replying, "You understand nothing. The spirit has many names. Some call it God, others science. We merely sought knowledge others were too weak to pursue. The elevation of our followers was genuine. Their suffering had purpose. Their deaths had meaning." This shocking confession reframed the entire investigation. What many had assumed to be religious fanaticism was now revealed to be a twisted fusion of cult ideology and pseudo-medical experimentation. The revelation sent shockwaves through the medical community. Institutions that had once accepted research specimens from the Ravencrofts faced intense scrutiny, sparking a national debate on ethical standards in medicine and research. As investigators resumed their grim excavation of the church grounds that autumn, it became clear that Prophet Caleb's estimate of 217 victims was a gross understatement. By September 1851, Agent Blackwood reported that at least 276 bodies had been recovered. Structural analysis suggested there could be even more beneath adjacent properties, indicating the church had been expanding its subterranean network as their operation grew. More disturbing still was evidence that not all victims were willing. Letters between Elder Ezra and associates in nearby towns revealed a network for luring vulnerable individuals, travelers, immigrants, and the socially isolated under the pretense of offering work or shelter. One letter read, "The red-haired Irishman who passed through last Thursday would make an excellent vessel. I have directed him to Ravenwood with promise of employment." This moved the case from a horrifying religious cult to something closer to an organized system of abduction, experimentation, and murder. The idea that the brothers had operated within a wider web of collaborators, many of whom may have known the truth, deepened the horror and expanded the investigation's scope. The breakthrough that finally shattered the last veil of secrecy came in October 1851 with the discovery of Samuel Parsons, the church's former accountant. Living under an alias in Massachusetts, Parsons had fled in 1849 after discovering financial records linked to disappearances. Granted immunity, he testified that he'd initially believed he was managing legitimate donations and church operations. But upon seeing payments for specimen preparation matched with names of missing congregants, he began keeping a secret ledger. When Elder Ezra discovered this, Parsons was scheduled for special prayer counseling, a known euphemism for selection. He fled that very night. Parsons revealed the existence of a second site referred to by the brothers as the Garden, located about 40 miles from Ravenwood. Only Ezra Silas and 2 trusted aides ever went there. When investigators located the farmhouse, what they discovered eclipsed even the atrocities under the church. The building had been transformed into a high-functioning research compound. Records and specialized rooms revealed that subjects, often children, were kept alive for weeks or months while being systematically experimented on. A separate building housed small cells and child-sized medical restraints. According to documentation, at least 37 children aged 4 to 16 had been held there between 1840 and 1851. The New York Tribune ran the headline, "Monsters in Human Form, Ravencroft Brothers' Crimes Against Innocents Revealed." Public outrage exploded. Protests erupted across the Northeast demanding justice. In custody, Elder Ezra began speaking to invisible presences in his cell, while Silas attempted suicide after being shown photographs from the garden. By the end of 1851, the investigation had grown beyond a local scandal. It was a national reckoning with implications for religion, medicine, and the ethical limits of science. Yet Agent Blackwood remained uneasy. In his journal, he wrote, "I am increasingly convinced we have uncovered only the visible portion of something far more extensive. The Ravencrofts are guilty beyond doubt, but I fear they were part of a larger network. Their access to funds, equipment, and institutional silence suggests complicity at higher levels. The question that haunts me is not whether justice will be served, but whether the full truth will ever come to light." That haunting question hung over the trial that began in Albany on January 12, 1852. The courthouse overflowed daily with thousands of spectators. Press from across the country descended on what was now known as the trial of the Unholy Brothers. The prosecution presented over 100 witnesses, survivors, who described the indoctrination, doctors who explained the physical evidence, and families of victims who told stories of spiritual promises turned into unspeakable loss. Among them was Sarah Wilkinson, whose 16-year-old daughter Emma had joined the church in 1847. Emma's letters became increasingly strange, culminating in one final note, stating she had been selected for a special blessing. When Wilkinson traveled to Ravenwood, she was told Emma had been taken to the retreat and could not receive visitors. 3 weeks later, Elder Ezra informed her that Emma had ascended. She was never allowed to see the body. "I was told she had been sanctified," Wilkinson testified, her voice trembling, "that her body could not leave church grounds. I should rejoice, but all I wanted was to bring her home." This trial was more than a prosecution. It was a reckoning with what happens when charisma, belief, and power are used to justify inhumanity. And yet, even as justice approached, the deepest question remained. Was this a horrific anomaly, or merely one chapter of a larger hidden history waiting to be unearthed? Throughout the trial, the Ravencroft brothers' behaviors could not have been more different. Deacon Silas appeared sunken, withdrawn, speaking only in hushed tones to his attorneys and avoiding eye contact. Elder Ezra, by contrast, remained eerily composed, occasionally smiling as damning testimony was read aloud, and even nodding in approval when the grotesque details of his crimes were recounted. When the defense presented its case in late February 1852, its strategy was made clear. It would not deny the deaths, or even the cruel rituals described, but instead argue that all actions conducted by the Church of the Pure Spirit were protected religious practices under the U.S. Constitution. Defense attorney William Hargrove insisted that while the Church's methods may seem shocking, its followers had willingly participated, believing in purification through suffering. This argument unraveled swiftly under cross-examination. Former church members testified to deception, psychological manipulation, and the use of opium-laced concoctions to induce compliance and alter perception. The defense was ultimately obliterated by documents from the garden, which proved that many of the victims hadn't joined the church at all but had been kidnapped, drugged, and used for experimentation. Then on March 2nd, Elder Ezra made a move that would etch his name into the annals of American legal infamy. Against his attorney's advice, he requested to testify in his own defense. The judge reluctantly allowed it. For nearly 4 hours, Ezra delivered what amounted to a sermon, a twisted, polished fusion of religious mysticism and cold scientific logic. He denied nothing. He apologized for nothing. Instead, he rationalized every murder as sacrifice, every scream as progress. Death comes to all, he said to a stunned courtroom. We merely gave it purpose. Their suffering was temporary, their contribution eternal. When asked about the children, Ezra replied with chilling certainty, "The young vessel receives the Spirit most purely." Their observations were most valuable precisely because they were unclouded by preconception. At this, Harold Winters, father of a boy who had vanished after attending church in 1847, leapt from the gallery with a concealed knife. He was restrained before reaching Ezra, who did not move or flinch. He calmly remarked, "Even now, truth provokes violence from those too limited to comprehend it." After this chilling display, Deacon Silas declined to testify. His attorney offered only a plea for leniency, citing Ezra's overwhelming influence on his brother. The prosecution closed by emphasizing the premeditated nature of the crimes, the monstrous betrayal of trust, and the perversion of both faith and science. On March 10, 1852, the jury returned after less than 3 hours, guilty on all counts. Judge William Blackwood sentenced both brothers to hang, declaring their actions an abomination against humanity and God alike. The execution was set for April 15th. But the story didn't end there. On March 20th, Prophet Caleb died under mysterious circumstances in the Utica Asylum. Official reports listed nervous exhaustion as the cause, but rumors swirled suicide or possibly vengeance carried out by an attendant, repulsed by Caleb's confessions. Then on April 7th, a fire broke out in the Albany jail. 3 inmates and 2 guards died from smoke inhalation. Investigators initially identified one of the bodies as Deacon Silas, citing his distinctive rings. But Elder Ezra was not among the dead or the living. A manhunt followed, the largest in New York history at the time. Wanted posters were circulated across the Northeast. Sightings poured in from Chicago, Montreal, and beyond, but none led to Ezra's capture. Some investigators, including Blackwood, began to suspect a deeper plot. The identification of Silas's body had been rushed. It relied more on personal effects than clear forensic recognition. And a disturbing clue emerged: 30,000 had been withdrawn from a church-associated account 2 days before the fire by a man matching the description of Jacob Thornton, one of Ezra's most fanatical followers. Then came the first retaliatory killing. In June 1852, Dr. Edward Mitchell, an Albany physician who had cooperated with authorities and testified against the Ravencrofts, was found murdered in his home. His body was arranged in the ceremonial posture used in church rituals. A note pinned to his chest read, "The Spirit sees all who betray its work." 2 more physicians were killed in similar fashion over the next year. Each had connections to the case. Each was left with a chilling message and displayed as though part of a ritual. The implication was clear. Someone, perhaps Ezra himself, or his remaining disciples, was carrying out retribution. By 1854, the investigation had officially wound down. Ezra was presumed to have fled the country, but rumors persisted. Reports of cults and religious groups with eerily similar doctrines surfaced in cities like New Orleans, St. Louis, and San Francisco. None led to his recapture. Agent Daniel Blackwood, though reassigned, never stopped investigating privately. In his final entry on the case, he wrote, "I no longer believe the Ravencrofts were acting alone. The scale, complexity, and endurance of their operation suggest complicity, perhaps from individuals in positions of influence. Ezra's escape, the killings of witnesses, and the persistence of similar sects all point to a larger network. We have exposed a horror, but I fear the heart of it remains untouched, still beating somewhere in the dark." What began as a tale of religious fervor twisted into cruelty became something far more haunting, a chilling testament to how belief, when weaponized, can conceal the most unthinkable crimes. And even after the fire, the verdict, and the deaths, the shadow of the Church of the Pure Spirit remained, its whispers echoing in the margins of history, waiting to be heard again. The documents were consistent with Elder Ezra Ravencroft's distinctive hand. The box, labeled only "For the Keepers of Truth," included diagrams of the human nervous system with notations regarding threshold points of transcendence, correspondences with pseudonyms used across Europe and South America, and chilling records of continued experimentation, some involving child subjects, others describing voluntary initiates from what Ezra described as the new flock. The latest journal entry, dated 1898, ominously declared, "The work has endured longer than even I imagined. The Spirit is patient, its revelation draws near." This final chapter, so long after the official conclusion of the case, solidified what many feared, that Elder Ezra had not only survived, but thrived in the shadows for nearly half a century, continuing his grotesque fusion of spiritual doctrine and human experimentation. Though no official confirmation of his survival was ever recorded, the precision of the notes, the continuity of philosophical themes, and the consistency in handwriting left little room for doubt among experts. A legacy of shadows and reform. Daniel Blackwood, who had retired in 1860, after a decade of tracking the Ravencroft network, prophetically concluded in his final report, "We have not ended this enterprise. We have merely unmasked it." His prediction echoed across the decades as fragmented sightings and obscure groups continued to mimic the Church's ideology under different names across different geographies. Though Ezra's physical presence faded from view, his ideological contagion endured, shaping splinter sects from New England to the American West. The Sanctuary of Divine Understanding, discovered in 1862, became the last federally acknowledged site linked directly to Ravencroft ideology. The journal found there, unmistakably in Ezra's hand, was the final smoking ember of a fire that had once consumed hundreds of lives. That its closing message envisioned the full revelation emerging a century later added a disturbing prophecy that haunted both investigators and occult historians for generations: the aftermath and cultural reckoning. In the wake of the Church's exposure, and particularly after the harrowing discoveries at the Garden, the government quietly archived all physical evidence in a classified repository within the Department of Justice. These artifacts, journals, surgical tools, ritual scripts, and over 1,000 pages of anatomical documentation remained sealed, largely untouched, into the 20th century. The town of Ravenwood, burdened by infamy, slowly emptied. Its population declined by over half in the following decade. The former church land was declared state property and left undeveloped. Locals referred to it simply as the hollow ground. What couldn't be erased was the community's trauma and the role of survivors in founding what became known as the Assembly, a watchdog and advocacy group dedicated to exposing abuse masquerading as religious freedom. By the 1870s, this group had expanded to include not just survivors of the Ravencroft cult, but others from similar experiences, many of which bore unmistakable echoes of the Church of the Pure Spirits ideology, a catalyst for medical ethics. Perhaps the most measurable legacy of the Ravencroft scandal was its influence on medical reform. The public outcry over the sale and use of human remains catalyzed a major reevaluation of how cadavers were sourced for medical education. In 1855, the American Medical Association issued its first formal code of ethics requiring rigorous documentation and consent protocols for anatomical donations. Dr. William Harrison, who had helped expose the church's links to academic institutions, became a national advocate for scientific ethics. His 1860 treatise, The Moral Imperative in Scientific Inquiry, explicitly addressed the Ravencroft case, arguing science born of cruelty is itself deformed. No true knowledge can come from instruments forged in suffering. By 1870, multiple states had enacted anatomical transparency laws ensuring the legal acquisition of bodies and regulating medical school practices. The lingering shadow. From 1865 to 1890, at least 7 known cult-like groups in the U.S. were dismantled for promoting suffering-based spiritual enlightenment. Many of these traced directly to Ravencroft followers who had avoided prosecution. The most notable, led by Brother Elijah in Missouri, was uncovered in 1879. When arrested, he was revealed to be Thomas Whitfield, one of the original church's inner circle. Rather than face trial, Whitfield ended his own life, leaving behind journals soaked in Ravencroft terminology and beliefs. Even with no confirmed sightings of Ezra Ravencroft after 1852, the decades that followed were haunted by his mythology. He became a near mythic figure in American occult history, part cult leader, part scientist, part bogeyman. Reports of his presence in New Orleans spiritualist circles, San Francisco communes, and even European medical symposia were never verified but always carried the same disturbing themes: religious transcendence through suffering, worship of pain, and the pursuit of knowledge beyond moral boundaries. Conclusion: a warning unheeded. The Ravencroft case was by any measure one of the darkest intersections of faith power and pseudoscience in American history. It exposed the terrifying ease with which charisma, conviction, and institutional blindness can be weaponized against the vulnerable. It forced a reckoning in medicine and in the legal treatment of religious freedom. Yet for all that was uncovered, hundreds of victims, countless records and testimonies, the case left behind more than scars. It left behind a legacy of silence, of unanswered questions, and of a lingering possibility that somewhere in some new form the work may yet continue. The last known journal entry in Elder Ezra's hand, discovered in the iron box donated to Harvard, offered this parting declaration: "The Spirit endures, and so do its servants. The world may forget, but revelation remembers. When the time is right, those with eyes to see will find the path again. We planted seeds, and they grow in places unseen." As the century turned and the horrors of the Ravencroft legacy faded into shadows, a final echo emerged, one that would raise more questions than it answered. Among the papers anonymously donated to Harvard Medical School in 1899, experts identified the most recent journal entries as written in Elder Ezra's distinctive hand, though aged and uneven, betraying the frailty of a man nearing the end of his life. The final entry, dated December 31st, 1898, read, "As the century draws to its close, so too does my work in this vessel. Age has finally accomplished what the law could not. I go now to join the pure spirit content in knowing that the seeds we planted have taken root and will flower in ways we could only imagine. The next generation of seekers will build upon our foundation, finding new methods for the great work of transcendence. The suffering was necessary. The knowledge remains. The spirit continues. Whether this represented Elder Ezra's true final words or an elaborate forgery has never been conclusively determined. If genuine, it would place his age at an implausible, but not impossible, 115 years. But more significant than the question of authorship was the undeniable evidence that the journals contained detailed experimental protocols, frightening in origin, yet astonishingly influential. Researchers later discovered striking parallels between the Ravencroft materials and certain legitimate medical practices that emerged in the early 20th century, suggesting that their corrupt knowledge had bled into accepted science. From archive to warning. Harvard authorities, horrified by the implications, immediately sealed the collection. By 1902, in coordination with federal officials, the materials were quietly relocated to a secure government archive where they remained classified until 1972. Only then did limited access open to scholars studying the origins of medical ethics under strict supervision. Meanwhile, the site of the original Church of the Pure Spirit remained untouched until 1923, when New York State declared the area restricted. Locals spoke of strange sounds, eerie lights, and a profound silence that blanketed the land like a warning. In 1967, a Sunni archaeological team unearthed further tunnels and bones. Their discoveries raised the known victim count to over 400, revealing not just more bodies, but an entire sealed chamber containing blueprints, correspondence, and diagrams that indicated Ravenwood was meant to be just the beginning. The Ravencroft brothers had envisioned a network of similar cultic research sites across the country and abroad. The Ravencroft legacy. Today, more than 160 years after their empire of torment was exposed, the influence of the Ravencrofts remains a cautionary presence in multiple fields. In religious studies, their cult is a textbook example of how fervent belief, charismatic leadership, and the gradual normalization of extreme behavior can lead to atrocity, especially when followers are promised transcendence through suffering. In medical ethics, their case remains central to the foundation of modern standards. The abuses that once went unnoticed under their religious guise prompted the American Medical Association's first Code of Ethics in 1855 and inspired landmark legislation ensuring consent and transparency in anatomical research. In criminal psychology, the Ravencroft brothers are now seen as precursors to modern organized serial killers, except they operated under the protection of faith science and societal respectability, using institutional power to mask calculated cruelty. For families touched by their crimes, however, this legacy is not academic, it is personal. In 1902, survivors and descendants established a memorial in Albany, bearing a single inscription for those lost to darkness, that their suffering not be forgotten. Each year, on the anniversary of the fire that consumed the church, they gather quietly to remember unanswered questions. Despite volumes of testimony, thousands of documents, and decades of investigation, many questions remain. How did the Ravencrofts come to merge religion with experimentation so seamlessly? Who among their academic and medical contacts knowingly facilitated or turned a blind eye? Most disturbingly, how much of their work has survived, hidden in plain sight, influencing practices and ideologies long after their names were scrubbed from polite history. Agent Blackwood's question from 1852 still echoes. I cannot escape the suspicion that we have uncovered merely the visible portion of something far more extensive. His words remain unsettlingly relevant. The final mystery. The land in Ravenwood where the church once stood remains vacant. Despite decades of growth and progress, nothing has taken root there. Not even grass grows easily. Locals say the air changes near the old foundations, that even the birds go silent. On windless nights, they say the silence is absolute. Sound, warmth, and light seem to vanish into the earth, as though the ground itself still hungers. Whatever the final truth may be, whether Ezra Ravencroft died in 1898 or vanished, yet again the lesson endures. Civilization is a fragile veneer. When science and belief are unmoored from morality, even the noblest pursuits can be twisted into instruments of horror. Do you believe all the truth was ever revealed? Could the spirit of the Church of the Pure Spirit still linger in the institutions we trust today? Leave your thoughts below, and if you're drawn to stories that explore the darkest corners of human belief and ambition, make sure to like, subscribe, and share with someone who loves a chilling mystery. Thank you everyone for watching the video. Remember to like and subscribe to the channel to watch the next interesting videos.